Hi, I'm Jim Berger, pastor at Holy Cross Lutheran Church in Houston, Texas. And this is a sermon for the 11th Sunday after Pentecost to be preached on August 9th, 2026, Matthew 14, 22 to 33. The In Between Storm. Tom Waits, Los Angeles urban street poet, chants the Talking Blues lyrics. I quote, "Things are tough all over when the thunderstorms start increasing over the southeast and south central portions of my apartment. I get upset, and a line of thunderstorms is developing in the early morning, with tornado watches issued for the areas including the western region of my mental health and the northern portion of my ability to deal rationally with my disconcerted, precarious emotional situation. Flash flood watches covered the southern portion of my disposition." That's on the album Nighthawks at the Diner, the Emotional Weather Report. Bad weather is part of life. Sometimes even heavy emotional weather, like regular heavy atmospheric weather, it can be distracting, but it is a temporary condition. Fascinating, fearful, dangerous. Storms put the adrenaline in your blood and your blood into your large muscles, fight or flight. Now, Midwestern farmers enjoy the weather, even watching for tornadoes. Uh, we'd sit in our vehicles on the sandy section line roads in the middle of Kansas, watching to the southeast for clouds with circulation that might drop a funnel onto the prairie. The narrow roads were lined with hedge apple trees, otherwise called Osage oranges or bois d'arc, planted as windbreaks and snow fences for the fields. We did not chase tornadoes, they chased us, and we knew which direction to run. One day, a friend was justified in his storm observation. A funnel dropped on a road about a mile away, and it was coming straight east toward him. He took off east in front of the looming funnel, looking for the next best southbound turnoff, running about 65 on a sand road good for about 35. The storm would sooner or later angle northeast in its path because of the prevailing south wind. He kept checking the rearview mirror. He figured the devil was chasing him, because behind him he could see trees folding in on the road from both sides and then crazily floating up into the spinning black jaws of the storm. He outran it and had a great story to tell. Last week we explored the political storms of Jesus' day, the storms of hoped for revolution brewing in or on the near horizon. Today's narrative takes us from the site of the feeding of the multitude across the Galilee into a storm. Jesus sends the disciples out to sea and dismisses the crowd who were probably still intent on somehow, somewhere, figuring out how to revolt against Rome. Those miracles of both healing and feeding would seem to many like Jesus is the one who should be leading a successful revolution against the empire. They would carry him as their king in triumph into Jerusalem at the time of the Passover. The crowd wants to force God's historical hand. And somehow Jesus manages to get the disciples packed up on a boat to sail for unfamiliar territory. He gets the crowd dismissed so he can take some time to pray again. He is in the wilderness with the tempter. Jesus is personal, always in between storm. But then, in that in between time, the in between storm breaks loose on the poor disciples in their little boat. Matthew, not even subtly, lifts up the disciples in the early church as a boat beset by a storm. Matthew says their boat was tortured and tormented in the same manner as a small but growing group that followed in Jesus' way, tortured and tormented by both religious and political adversaries. The disciples embarked at dusk. They are still rowing and bailing in the wee hours before dawn, exhausted beyond measure. They're hungry, they're freezing and afraid of dying. The chaos is overwhelming. They're battered and all hope is lost. Summer of 1970, I had a little in-between storm. It was the first event in between the transition from civilized comforts of a home over summer break to the raw, unforgiving wilderness of the Wind River mountain range in Wyoming. 6 weeks of primitive survival started with canoeing whitewater on the Green River in metal canoes. The attitude of the guides was sink or swim. After this test, there would be no quitting and no evacuations. Having a hard time? Tough. This is the last chance to ring the bell and take the only bus back to Lander and wash out. If you break a leg, tough. You make a splint and a crutch and walk out with one guide. The guide said, meet us in 4 hours downriver. We'll be there. They assigned buddies. We launched. My buddy had never been in a boat in his life. A total city kid, spoiled, not smart enough to be a nerd. I kept yelling at him, just sit still and quit rowing. Every time he put his oar in the water, the canoe would turn around and spin backwards down the swift current. Everybody left us in their wake. We were all alone. At our first set of rapids, we got sideways on a boulder in the middle of the river. The water was pouring into the canoe, wedging it around the rock. I dragged my buddy by his life jacket in freezing, pounding water to the bank of the river. Miraculously, an angel on horseback showed up and was there watching. Looked like a grizzled old cowboy to me. He was an Arapaho from the reservation we were traveling through. Technically, we were in a different nation, there by permission only of the tribal authority, who watched carefully with trackers. He gave me a rope. I waded over to the wrecked port with the scout's rope, and he and his horse pulled it off the rock and dragged it to shore, which time we jumped up and down on it to get it flattened out and straightened out. And my buddy didn't do anything. He was headed toward hypothermia. All but sunk by this storm of white water, we now entered the storm, almost freezing to death on a sunny day at high altitude, surrounded by stormy waters of snowmelt. My buddy was stunned by his fear and quaking with hypothermia, but at least he was too exhausted to row. So he just curled up and cried. I rowed like my life depended on it because I'm pretty sure it did. I didn't want to wash out of survival school before it even started, abandoned in the wilderness. This wasn't a vacation. It doesn't matter who we are, what we do. We face storms when we least expect them. In the in-between times, Jesus sends his disciples into the in-between. They're traversing from familiar territory to a strange place, sailing from the known to the unknown, sailing from a shattered world to a mastered world, then into a shattered world, to the lake of the Gentile side. What is familiar has been left behind. The future shores are out there in the future, awaiting our arrival. The in-between chaos is frightening and exhausting. And we see the new shore with worry and trepidation and fear, even though it could be an opportunity. In God's loving grace, we are sent into mission by Jesus, and he's always there with us, okay? One point is, do not let circumstances around you distract you from God. Don't do it. The storm doesn't have to be overwhelming. Sooner or later, it will be over. Even when profoundly disturbing, it's temporary. The next time a storm hits you, ask yourself, does this really change your relationship with God? I hope it doesn't. We don't worship the storm. We observe it carefully, monitor its direction, respond appropriately. Perhaps that observation would take a little wind out of the sails of those who have bemoaned the state of the church over the last 5 decades. The analysts and pollsters keep saying that the church is in trouble. Attendance is down. The faithful are fearful, not faithful. It's good to listen, honor their opinion, but in another sense, we might respond by noting the church is in trouble? Well, what else is new? The church working in mission is always in trouble. You don't get flack unless you're over the target. It's a little boat. This grand institution we're a part of, when compared to the vast sea of chaos and storms we seek to sail. Sometimes we row against each other and even wreck the boat, or just curl up in the hull, quivering helplessly in the cold. The great, unbelievable news is that Jesus is walking, maybe even dancing, across the chaos to us. The disciples cry out in fear, and Jesus says, "It is I. I am who I am." That's Yahweh. Exactly God's answer when Moses asked him his name. In between all that is happening, the struggling chaos of the storm, God's there. We won't sink. I grew up with animals. My first word was kitty, much to the chagrin of my mother, who was waiting for mama. It was her fault. She'd stand in the kitchen door under the windmill and call the cats in for supper. Kitty, 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 kitty. Great word, repeated often. Loud word. Word that produced friendly creatures. And K's are easier to pronounce than M's for a first word. Singer, a long-haired blonde cat, slept with me from the time I came home from the hospital after I was born. He was 10 years old then, and I laid beside him under the dining room table as he died. I was 10 years old then. Mom got me a new cat. I named her Tinkerbell. She was so little and light-footed that she could tiptoe on the piano keys without making a sound. However, she was not allowed on the piano. Mom, nobody appreciated cat hair clogging up the piano keys. Whenever Tinkerbell was caught there, she faced stormy hollering. She would take off running down the keyboard, making odd music. We called it the cat panic arpeggio. It must be scared cats heavier. Maybe that's why Peter sang. He panicked and got scared. And, well, his name did mean rock, and the longest I've ever seen a rock walk on water is 7 skips, and that's a flat rock thrown by a good sidearm pitcher on a perfectly glassy lake. And I can imagine Thomas back in the boat. He's pretty realistic. He's shouting out to Peter, "Look out, Rocky, here comes a big wave." Storms, by their nature, command attention. Just don't let circumstances around you distract you from God. The in-between time from the port you have left and the port you are going to might be stormy, but not that overwhelming if you stay in the boat. Stay focused on the mission. Let God come into your consciousness and life awareness. Cosmic safety over local chaos. For 20 years, a monk studied under a master. Every morning he went out to meditate. He came back soaking wet. His master never asked, but always wondered, that's strange, why? Finally, one day, the monk came back. He was dry. He was dancing with joy, beside himself. He excitedly told of 20 years of trying to walk on water as a spiritual discipline. And finally, this day, he did it without sinking. The master thought about it. And he said, for $1, you could have taken the ferry and brought bread to the hungry on the other side. And despite his sinking, Peter's a cool guy. He has a mad faith. Anyone in their right mind wouldn't even think of walking water, especially in a battering storm. He dreamed of going beyond the impossible. At least he dared, in the presence of Christ, to undertake what others feared and would never consider. Regardless of the storm, Peter leaped before he looked so that he could participate in a miraculous walk with our Lord. This is, above all, a beautiful failure story. Even in our churchy language, we talk of coming to Jesus, as if our willpower and strong faith could pull that little trick off. With deep compassion, Jesus honors our efforts with the understanding that when we fall, when we sink, when the storm destroys us, Jesus is immediately by our side, catching us. He comes to us, not the other way around. Peter failed what he wanted to do, but succeeded mightily in being saved. God's walking around in our storms also, risking, walking, sinking, and knowing that the salvation relief of Jesus lifting us back up is the joy of living in faith. Do not let circumstances around you distract you from God. No need to panic. No need to let the storm put the vice grips on your mental health. God enjoys weather, and we're never alone, especially if we can enjoy strolling with Him and seeking His help in the risky storms of life. When Peter realizes he's in trouble, he prays. And it's not the prayer of pious and long winded preachers. Peter's prayer is short and concise. 3 words: Lord, save me. When we are doing our business in deep water, all we need to do is pray for help. It's not about walking on water, it's about getting back in the boat, staying in our mission, and hanging out with Jesus in the in between storm. Amen.